Hello and welcome to the May 29th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I'm Anthony Bardaway, here with Romeo.
Hey, folks.
So this episode will be a real news roundup kind of episode. These last few, we have focused in on smaller number of stories. This one will be a list of a lot of stories. So we have updates on the continued battles in Kharkiv, as well as Russia continuing to just devastate the city of Kharkiv with continuous bombing. As of the time of recording, there are missiles in the air headed for the city as we speak. We'll also then get into some of Russia's escapades outside of Ukraine, particularly their aggression in the Baltic Sea, some moves by both the Europeans and the Russians in the diplomatic sphere, a purge in the Russian army, as well as some updates from Georgia. And we'll be closing out with the reigning champion, Oleksandr Usyk, the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. But first, I want to start off with some of my roamings around the city of Kyiv. There were some, small local stories that I think tell more than what they are just on the surface. So last week, I went to the location of the Ukrainian National History Museum. It is on a hill in the old central part of the city, like a nice old building. The museum itself is, I recommend it if you go there. And it overlooks Podil, like the kind of cool neighborhood next to the major cathedrals. It's where you go to spend a weekend. But the reason I went there this time around was that recently a Russian Orthodox chapel that had been built illegally on the site of the museum was finally torn down. The backstory of this is that basically the site of on this hill, back in the Middle Ages, there is something called the Church of the Tithes. The Church of the Tithes was the primary cathedral of the medieval city of Kyiv. It was where the rulers of the Rurik dynasty were buried. It was also where the city had its last stand during the Mongol invasion and where people were slaughtered by the Mongols. It's a very historically important location and religiously important location. Throughout history since then, different versions of this church had been, after they were destroyed, then rebuilt and destroyed, and until they were eventually torn down completely by the Soviets in the early Soviet period. If you go there now, you can see the foundations of the original church, but nothing else is left, at least above ground. But again, this site was still very important. So about 15 years ago, a initiative by the Russian Orthodox Church wanted to build something on the site, and they decided to go about it in a very illegal way. So they built their chapel without really any of the formal permissions required to do that. It was an illegal construction. Sad to say, these are quite common in Kyiv, people obtaining some bit of property through basically making up papers. Sometimes the papers would not exist at all and just say this is ours now because we say it's ours now and start building. I know a few locations within walking distance of me under that exact same condition. It's a real kind of problem for city planning, let's just say that. But this was more or less a squat that the Russian Orthodox Church put up on the property of the National Museum. They did this without any formal permissions. They did it without an archaeological survey, which would have been pretty important for, an important medieval historical site. You're actually supposed to kind of dig and see that you're not going to destroy anything when you build something new. This is a very common situation.
Pre-medieval site. It's a Scythian archaeological dig site.
Oh, yeah, that as well. I mean, everywhere you go, there's something, especially that part. You have a hill overlooking a important river. Archaeology is very important for this kind of things. So the Russian Orthodox Church built a chapel without any of this, but this was during the Yanukovych era where the Russian Orthodox Church could do whatever it wanted. And they had the protection and informal permissions of basically Yanukovych's goons said, you're allowed to do this because we say you're allowed to do this. And it was an incredibly corrupt time where Yanukovych saying something meant that it could be done. In that time, it always had a bit of a reputation. When I first came to Kyiv, the person who showed me this hill, they themselves explained to me this situation and said, yeah, this is just like the mafia church. It was sometimes known as MOF, meaning like small structure, basically.
MOF's a term, or MOF. It's a term basically applied to kiosks. Was used in this term, and usually these kiosks, these are like kiosks that sell food or some other minor kind of product. A lot of the time they are built illegally, and that's why this term was applied to the church, since it was also kind of seen as this shabby little kiosk-ish structure.
Yeah, so obviously the play on words there is small mafia in this case. And whenever I showed new people around the city and we would go up on that hill, I would tell that story again, how this is the illegal mafia church. And especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when abuses by the Russian Orthodox Church have been under much tighter scrutiny, last year there was a court order to finally take it down. This led to a whole other controversy. The Russian Orthodox Church complained. It was a whole deal, but a independent charitable association actually raised the funds themselves in order to demolish it, because that became a part of the controversy is, well, who's going to pay to tear it down? And some fine people of Kyiv said, we'll pay for it to get rid of this thing.
Clearly, the city can't do it, despite it being built on city property and illegal. But the city couldn't possibly be involved.
Well, it turned out that eventually the city decided, yes, we can do it ourselves. So the people who raised the money to tear it down then decided to just donate that money to the military. So then, just last week, the city finally decided to tear this little chapel down. And it looks exactly like those cheap kiosks. There's like the base foundation, and like it looks like what now used to be a former shawarma stand that was illegally constructed. So I go there. There's a group of, babushki, like old women, who would go to that chapel. They were very angry that this happened. They were talking about, the brotherhood and all that. Bratsovo was the word they kept saying. It has very Russian Orthodox overtones in this case. The one crazy guy kept yelling about just random nonsense. He was very clearly crazy. He was very mad and yelling at the police and people around him. Observers were then saying, oh, the Muscoli are up to their nonsense now. It was not many people, but it seemed like everyone had a very strong opinion at that moment. And overall, there was also a group of police that stayed just out of sight, like they were hiding behind the museum. I didn't see them at first, but then once I went to walk around, the perimeter of the hill, as I do, because it's nice, I run into about 6 cop cars in case any provocateurs decide to start anything up. But there weren't reports of any violence or anything like that, so they weren't especially necessary. So that is, a story of how things have gone. The Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine has a long history of just saying that stuff is theirs without it actually being theirs. And through the power of political connections and general cultural momentum, they have been able to hold on to their ill-gotten gains for a very long time until the full-scale invasion kind of snapped everyone out of it and said, okay, we should probably not let them do illegal stuff anymore. Oh, that was just the story of the church, the chapel there. It's gone now. And I'll close it off by saying that while I was there was also someone taking their goats for a walk. I thought that was funny and cute.
I mean, to be honest, for Kyiv, that is pretty unusual.
Yeah, it's not a farm town, but they had leashes and everything. They were well cared for goats. But yeah, the other adventure I had is I went to a newly built pedestrian bridge in the Oblon district of Kyiv. It's on the right bank or western side of the city, the northernmost part of the right bank. And for the last several years, there has been a park built on one of the islands there. Well, this week was the grand opening of a brand new pedestrian bridge that was launched with all the fanfare of Mayor Klitschko. Now, under normal conditions, this would be nice. Like, oh, cool, new park. Let's go to new park. But we're in a war, and everyone is supposed to be chipping in for the war, which is why that every week on Sunday, people are at City Hall protesting needless spending by the city government, often on things like landscaping, beautification campaigns, protesting against that kind of thing. And here we are renovating a whole island and building a very expensive bridge to it. This obviously made a lot of civil society people very angry. The government tried to make them less angry by saying that no, these are not from city funds. These are actually donated. A lot of the funding for this pedestrian bridge, a suspension bridge actually, came from the city of Paris. The municipality of Paris provided some of the funding, and a lot of local rich people. But then the obvious counter to that is, well, why are these local rich people paying for a suspension bridge to a park when they could be buying drones? And back and forth, no matter what people can complain about, it's done, the money's spent, it's there. But this has been a continuous problem with Mayor Klitschko. He's been known for wasting money. He's not especially popular, especially among the civil society anti-corruption set. We'll say that. And just one thing to close that out, though. Obolon is not like a fancy neighborhood per se, but they decided to build this bridge immediately behind the fancy country club. So it feels, even if it's not really, like an extension of the country club, which to me does not seem like a very good look.
That whole kind of part of Obolon is incredibly posh, especially the riverbank area. The part that comes directly onto the river boardwalk is just filled with really, really bougie, expensive houses. Most of them are empty.
Some of them literally look like castles.
Yes, and some of them, this is not a part of town that you would expect to see anything less than Mazdas and Lexuses in. And you don't, actually. It is an incredibly posh part of town.
They wanted to build something for themselves. But it's
one of the reasons that people got so mad about it, because it's very clearly a beautification project by rich people who live in the area and probably have country club memberships.
Though I will say that I am a golfer, and this country club is terrible. It's just a driving range. It's a driving range with a restaurant. It's not actually a golf course. So I don't know why they call it that.
It definitely looks like a country club.
It looks like one from the outside, but it's not really. So those are my walkabouts in the city. Tales of corruption, anti-corruption. It's all there if you have the eyes to look for it. But now we're getting into the battlefield update. And I will say that in the last 2 weeks, since our last battlefield update, there has been, again, a slowdown of the Russian advances. Avdiivka, not so much there. The Russians continue to advance at pace in Avdiivka. There have been no further breakouts like the one that we saw more recently, but they are keeping going. They are approaching the next line of canals and irrigation reservoirs, so they might be slowed down there. But the Avdiivka direction is looking as bad as it has been since the fall of the city. Bakhmut, same story, very marginal gains. They are creeping out of Bakhmut towards Chasiv Yar. They hold a bit more of the riverbank of the canal there than they had before, but very minorly, very positional fighting. And then in Kharkiv, after the invasion of the Kharkiv Oblast, again, it seems to have been drug out. The Russians hit, after advancing at a pretty substantial pace and taking about half of the town of Volchansk, it seems as though they have in the last few days at least, not proceeded any further. So they have mostly hit the Donets and Vovchka rivers, Vovchansk, where they get the name, as geological barriers, and have not been able to proceed beyond them. So Vovchansk is about half occupied, and the evacuation process from Vovchansk has been very problematic, to the point where there were a few days where the army did not allow evacuations to happen because it was too dangerous to be above ground for literally any amount of time, even if that is just to escape the city. That is how bad Vovchansk is looking right now. And as we always talk about, most of the people that are still there are the very elderly. I saw one video of an older woman in the Kharkiv Oblast who was refusing to evacuate. She said that it was because she could not take her tractor. That's when you see these videos and people say, I can't bring this thing. That's not really why. It will be an excuse they have for not being able to leave home. So when you're mentally editing what you're watching, replace I can't leave my tractor, I can't leave my car, I can't leave this or that, replace it with I can't leave my home. It's a difficult thing to do mentally, and most of the people refusing to do it, as is always the case, tend to be the elderly and poor.
And Vovchansk is also, it's like a sizable town. It's not a one road village like a lot of these kind of border settlements. It's a pretty significant, like, urban area. And the pictures of the city, they just show not a single building that hasn't sustained some kind of battle or shelling damage.
It's horrifying what's happening there. It's now urban fighting, and a lot
street to street urban fighting, street to street, the worst.
Basement to basement, ugly stuff. And even when you look at a lot of the maps, deep state and all that, there's a very substantial part of the battlefield right now that's considered gray zone, meaning that neither side fully controls it, but both sides will work within it. So I say that Russia did not advance further than the Volchka rivers, and that's true, but the northern part of the city is a lot of gray zone. Rather than anyone actually holding it. It's, like I said, urban warfare. So the Battle of Kharkiv, it has largely stalemated what we're seeing. This was actually, I think, predicted, as I said, when this offensive first started. A lot of the military intelligence was saying that this would not be a dedicated push towards the city of Kharkiv itself, and to look out for other offensives that can happen. So as we are watching this offensive grind to a halt, we really need to start looking towards Sumy. So the Russians have been gathering on the border towards the Sumy Oblast as well. The military intelligence has said they may try to do the same thing they did in Kharkiv Oblast. So we need to be very much on our toes of them trying the same in Sumy Oblast that they're doing to Kharkiv Oblast. And that is the situation on the battlefield. But if we look at Kharkiv city itself, there have been a number of very high-profile strikes on the city. And like I said in our intro, as we are recording, more bombs are coming. On May 23rd, the Russians targeted the Factor Druk print house, which is part of Vivat Publishing. The Factor Druk print house is not only the largest print house in Ukraine, but also one of the largest on the European continent. It supplies a substantial percentage of the Ukrainian publishing marketing share. We also have to underline this is not just an attack on culture or books or anything like that, but 7 people died and many other people were sent to the hospital. These were people who were working to like bookbinders and such like that, who were in the factory at the time and were killed, basically producing Ukrainian culture. And that is, of course, how it's been interpreted in Ukraine and is 100% why Russians did it. This was a major center of Ukrainian printed culture, Ukrainian books, translations into Ukrainian language of foreign books. Literature is something important, and especially in Ukraine, there's a very strong literary culture, and so attacking that culture directly has been direct aim of the Russian occupiers.
We've seen them in the occupied territories issue textbooks that completely erase any mentions of Ukrainian independence, any paint Ukrainian cultural and national heroes as evil monsters. Like they are very intent on wiping out any trace of Ukrainian identity.
So there was, so keep in mind that this is a topic I really want to return to. I'm making a note of that, of the destruction of Ukrainian literary and printed culture. But keep in mind that, yes, this is 100% a central goal of the Russian occupier, is the destruction of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian literary culture as an element of that. There's a poem written about this by Kristina Kotsira, I believe is her name is pronounced. I took this as a direct translation from Ukrainian, so this could sound a bit clunky, but here I go. The writer Vakulenko hid his manuscripts describing the occupation in a garden under a cherry tree. The Russians killed him. The writer Victoria Emelina found those manuscripts. The Russians killed her. Vivat Publishing House published Vakulenko's manuscripts. Russians hit the publisher's printing house. So yeah, just again, this is referring to Vakulenko, a children's writer who was summarily executed during the Russian occupation of Kharkiv Oblast. His writings were discovered by Victoria Emelina, a Ukrainian writer and war crimes reporter, who found them and printed them in a book. She was killed in a missile strike. And Vivat Publishing House was the publisher who printed this book that was rescued by a murdered journalist, by a murdered writer, and their people were murdered. It's just a string of horrific murders all attached intimately together by the Russians. And the other strike on Kharkiv was very dramatic, we can say, was on May 25th. They blew up an epicenter in Kharkiv. An epicenter is, how can I describe this? Take a Home Depot, attach it to a Best Buy, attach it to a furniture store.
Some apparel, like woods apparel, sports apparel stores. It's basically like a giant hypermarketized version of a Home Depot. It's a home goods store that also sells non-strictly home goods products.
This is now the start of summer. It was Memorial Day weekend, and though it's obviously not Memorial Day here, it's still the start of summer. And as it is everywhere, when it's the start of summer, you're going to the store to buy things to renovate your house, to plant your garden, to go through the various renovations and things that you say when you say, well, wait for better weather to start. And this epicenter in Kharkiv is where you go for such things. And the Russians blew it up in the morning on a weekend when the most people would be there. We know for sure that at least 18 people are dead, more injured, and some of these people had to be identified through DNA tests because their bodies were charred so extremely that otherwise they were unrecognizable as people. Since then, there have been more strikes on Kharkiv, more people killed, and it's just continuous hell in that city.
And of course, Russia is not limiting itself to simply murdering civilians who are doing their shopping. They've confirmed that they are holding a colleague of mine from my Hromadske days, Victoria Roshchyna, in Russia. She disappeared a year ago while going on a reporting trip to the occupied territories. We assume that she had been taken or killed, but the Russians have confirmed that they are holding her in custody. She is one of more than 100 journalists, Ukrainian and not, that have been in some way harmed by Russia during the full-scale invasion. And she is one of 12 in total Ukrainian journalists who are currently being held by the Russian authorities. It's tough for me personally because I worked with Vika pretty closely at times, and I simply can't even imagine what conditions she is being held in. Obviously, the Russians did not provide any information about her status or her health or anything like that. No contact information. They simply confirmed that she is being held, not even under what charges, simply that she is being held in their territory. So, yeah, the Russians, not great people.
So moving on more internationally, first we'll be looking at the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is basically that, for the geographically challenged out there, the Baltic Sea is the area of water basically to the other side of Denmark. The body of water have Sweden to the north of it, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland to the south of it, and Russia to the east of it. The Baltic Sea, as I've listed all those countries, of course, has many national delineations within it. In order to enter the Baltic Sea at all, for example, you're passing through Danish waters, and at different points of it, it's narrow enough that you're just, the border itself is in the sea. The issue of demarcating nautical borders is a very complicated topic in the field of international law. You are allowed to control a certain amount of distance from your shoreline. Islands are always a complicated thing, but especially in places that are as overseen as the Baltic, these borders are more or less pretty firmly in place. But Russia has never seen a border that it wanted to keep in place. Russia generally has a problem with the concept of where national borders ought to be. So they recently began to talk about wanting to move their nautical borders within the Baltic. At first, it seemed like a lot of hot air. Like, what would they really do? They specifically said some places, some islands that are in the Gulf of Finland on the way into St. Petersburg, their main city on that coast. There's a couple largely uninhabited islands that they said they wanted to kind of move their borders around. So far, that didn't amount to much. This sounded like it was basically a threat. But then they did something a bit more directly problematic. So the Narva River is the border between Estonia and Russia. There is Narva, the city, at the mouth of this river on the Baltic, names, of course. And in the middle of this river, there are a series of buoys that say that on this side, you're in Estonia, and on that side, you're in Russia. So Russia decided to remove these buoys as a way of saying that we are removing this border, we may move it forward. Attach this idea to what we talked about during the Georgia episode of how much Russia likes to move the border with South Ossetia and Georgia whenever they get the smallest opportunity to do so. It seems like they might start doing the same thing here of removing the physical barriers that delineate the border and just create more Russia at will. They have not done that part yet, but they're just doing provocations. However, one of the more problematic of these provocations is that in the past, more officially, Russian officials have said that they aimed to take the Isle of Gotland, which is a very heavily populated and very large island off the coast of Sweden. It's a part of Sweden. And you had a lot of, Russian military kind of ideological types saying that we need to invade Gotland. And we got a little bit of those threats here, though not from the Russian government. But Russia, for whatever reason, thinks that it can move forward its interests in the Baltic Sea much more aggressively. This does not seem like a winning formula to me. Their Black Sea fleet did not fare very well against Ukraine, which, as we always say, is a country without a functioning navy. And now they are trying to bring themselves into direct conflict with NATO over their borders with NATO, who have actually functioning navies. And not only that, but actual control of the Baltic Sea outside of a small area leading into St. Petersburg and another leading into Kaliningrad.
They don't already exert military control over the areas they've claimed. They literally just said, we're going to redraw the map, and that's it. They have literally zero way to enforce any of their absurd demands.
Yeah, you'd think that they would be a bit more realistic in a position where they are so obviously outclassed when they have not performed especially well when they had the advantage. I don't know what they hope to gain from this, except just to be a nuisance, but Russia likes trolling and like pissing people off, and that enough is a win for them just to be as much of a problem as they can be.
At the same time, we can't rule out that the Russians have some sort of medium or long-term plan for the region, because they have continued to use, for example, a GPS jammer that they have stationed in Kaliningrad, which is, quite frankly, simply a enormous safety hazard, since that is a very heavily trafficked area. Planes have reported losing GPS locks while flying over that region, which is less than ideal, though thankfully Europe is able to compensate. It's really hard to prognosticate what their game plan is in the Baltics. We know that they would, of course, love to conquer Lithuania and so on and so forth, but what exactly they're doing now with this and how in God's name they can possibly hope to accomplish any goal in the area is, quite frankly, beyond me.
Yeah, and when I say that these are nautical borders, in many cases, these are like right up against the land. They are saying that their border with Lithuania is different from what it actually is. They've made all the complicated excuses that you often hear within nautical law. It's, again, very complicated to study.
International maritime law is not fun.
It is like the one part of international law that's like real in a way, like it's actually followed like normal law.
Are in breach of the UN law on the sea. You actually will face real consequences. Kind of like piracy, no matter what kind of broken down or evil country you have, you still hate pirates just like everyone else.
Yeah, people make the joke, colonialism is when boats. In this case, international law is when boats. Like, that's when it's actual international law. So some of the arguments Russia has made has been like, well, like there are these surveys and these surveys have changed due to like water changing. So therefore, what should have been how it was this many years ago, this is how it is now. It's all just standard lawfare. They are claiming territory that belongs to other countries and is making implicit threats that they will act to defend their quote unquote territory.
What they are doing with the jammer in Kaliningrad really continues to pose as a head scratcher. There are numerous calls in the kind of expert community in the Baltics to simply bomb it. Some OSN researchers believe they have more or less narrowed down the exact location of the jammer in Russian territory. I don't see why not, to be honest. It's literally posing a safety threat to civilian flights and civilian shipping.
It is a weapon. Like, it's a weapon. It's an electronic warfare weapon that's being used against NATO assets. So attack it. But the Europeans have always been a bit gun shy.
They're incredibly lax when it comes to actually punishing Russia for the misdoings that it's committed in their own countries. Though not always, the Poles, for example, are very, in fact, militant against the Russians, with the Polish foreign minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, recently saying in a Guardian interview that Europe needs to rearm. It needs to really form the European army. He also mentioned, and I haven't seen this corroborated anywhere except for his word, but it probably is true. I have no reason to doubt it, that the U.S. has given Russia a red line on nuclear usage, though from the Ukrainian perspective, this is perhaps less of a red line than we'd like, but the gist is basically that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, regardless of the casualties, regardless of where the nuke is launched towards, the United States will hit every single position in Ukrainian territory with conventional weapons, which is, I suppose, some sort of deterrent. On the other hand, as a Ukrainian, I would really prefer that Washington just say, hey, we'll nuke Moscow if you nuke Kyiv, tit for tat.
Or just blow up all of the Russian positions in Ukraine right now with conventional weapons, and we'll wrap this war up real quick.
That would be even better.
Yeah, the issue with nukes, we've gone over it a bit in the past, but there was a time, the winter before last, especially when Russia was getting real aggressive in its language around nukes. They're basically threatening to nuke everyone all the time. And though those threats have continued, they are slower. And what seemed to me what happened was that President Xi of China had a good sit down with Putin and said, we don't mind if you want to, slap the West around a little bit to kind of shake up the world order, kill a bunch of Ukrainians along the way. That's collateral damage to us, but shut up about nukes. Nukes, we don't want the world destroyed because of your weird adventurism. And after that, they kind of seem to have listened to China about that, or not as being as direct with their nuclear threats as they used to be. But that did change more recently with Russia doing drills with tactical nukes and more suggestions from the Russians that they could deploy tactical nukes on the territory of Ukraine. So that's what this situation's about.
The Ukrainian government, to be honest, does not seem to really take or believe in any Russian threats of nuclear escalation. In fact, in the last few days, we've blown up to my knowledge, nuclear radar systems, basically radar systems that are intended to function as early warning systems in case of a nuclear first strike in Russia. We've blown up 2 of them. These radars are not critical to the Ukrainian war effort, but they are located over 1,000 kilometers behind the front line. Likely, the strikes were made simply to show that we can strike anywhere in Russia now. We have that capability even without cruise missiles, even without the ATACMS. We have the ability to blow up nuclear warning radars 1,800 kilometers inside Russia, which probably goes to show that the Ukrainians are not really worried about a nuclear strike from Russia, which, again, given the amount of graft and corruption, I honestly see where they're coming from. I don't believe it's probably not quite as cavalier about it as the Ukrainian military seems to be, but at the same time, it's very unlikely that they have more than a handful of actually functioning nuclear weapons. Incredibly unlikely, given what we know of the Russian military.
Well, to me, it's not even about if they have nuclear weapons. Even one nuclear missile is enough to be a deterrent. But the way that they talk about it, these Russian commentators are so cavalier with how they talk about the use of nuclear weapons of, we'll blow up London and then the world will know Russia's power. That's not how nuclear war works. Once you hit that launch nuclear missiles button, that means you said, I want humanity to essentially go extinct. It is not the thing that you talk that casually about, and it's not the thing that you actually use. There have been many points where Ukraine has crossed Russia's nuclear red lines. They said that they would use nuclear weapons to defend their constitutional territory. Well, their quote-unquote constitutional territory included the city of Kherson when that was taken back by the Ukrainian armed forces. They said they would basically use nukes if Ukraine takes back Kherson. Ukraine took back Kherson, and surprise, surprise, no nukes, and you never heard about that ever again. It is a lot of hot air. They know that they can basically troll you into backing down and doing what they want. And that doesn't have to be the case. So these strikes on these nuclear anti-nuclear radar systems, it's kind of a reminder. Nuclear war does not go in one direction. But other updates on the kind of Euro-American front is that France has decided to officially send advisors into Ukraine. There have been rumors about NATO advisors in Ukraine. Well, if you listen to the Russian propagandists, every time they blow up an apartment building, that apartment building was full of NATO generals. But there have been word of, a handful of British missile techs or something teaching Ukrainians how to do stuff in country. But it's all very kind of gray. Now we're going to officially have them from France, which is a pretty big change in things, much more direct engagement than it has been in the past.
Unfortunately, this means that Macron has decided not to send Marines to Odessa, as he kind of threatened to do or implied he would do. But, it's something. This is, I believe, the first official presence of NATO military within Ukraine.
Yeah, at least
the start of the full-scale war.
Yeah, there was like trainings and stuff before the full-scale invasion, but now this is the first time we're having direct NATO presence. Moving on to our next segment. In our last episode, we talked about how there was a very large reshuffle of the Russian civilian command, the Ministry of Defense, the National Security Council, people who aren't necessarily in the military or part of military command, but instead were the civilian oversight. However, in the 2 weeks sunset episode, Russia then continued to have a general purge of its actual military command. Many higher-ups who, some of them had been under investigation or arrested before that civilian changeover, but now it seems like there is a very large push to arrest large members of the Russian military command structures. So far, there have been 6 arrests, and these are Timur Ivanov, the former deputy defense minister, Lieutenant General Vadim Shamarin, General Yuri Kuznetsov, Ivan Popov, Vladimir Teleyev, and Vladimir Verteletsky. I'll go over who these people are, but in addition to these 6, there are rumors and suspicions that this purge will continue and envelop a lot more people than just this. So Timur Ivanov, the former deputy defense minister, was raised up to his positions by former Minister of Defense Shoigu, though of course in any case anyone in the defense ministry would have been raised by Shoigu. He's been in power for a number of years at this point, but very notably in 2016 he was put in charge of issues related to property management, building barracks, medical support for Russian soldiers. And as will be the theme for most of these guys, that is a major position for corruption. And the way those kinds of positions work in Russia is that they are rewards for loyalty. So because you are seen as a reliable person, you are then, well, your military paycheck is very, very low, basically nothing, but you are put into a position to be corrupt as payment for your loyalty and other services. So that he would be put in charge of property management, in any country, anything involving real estate isn't extraordinarily corrupt. Make that Russia and quadruple it. So he was seen as reliable enough to be given a very big money position like this. He also was in charge of overseeing a lot of the COVID response in 2020, which again, big money projects, and overall has been a kind of a manager, infrastructure type manager within the military. Vadim Shamarin, he was the head of the main communications directorate of the Russian Armed Forces. Not as much to say about him, but the next one more so, General Yuri Kuznetsov, head of Russian Defense Ministry's Personnel Department. Again, the Personnel Department, if you are the one in charge of appointing people to certain positions, if you're the HR guy behind the scenes has a lot of power. So again, another attractive position for corruption.
In fact, it's probably one of the more influential positions in the not official, perhaps, military hierarchy, but the corrupt military hierarchy, the vertical of corruption, in that it allows you to make up jobs that you can, like fake jobs that you can then put anyone's name onto. So, for example, you are a moderately wealthy businessman. You want to make sure your son isn't drafted. You go to your good friend, Yuri Kuznetsov, and he can make up a position at HQ that your son will never have to show up at. And as a result, dodge mobilization by being quote unquote conscripted. And obviously this is all done for a fee. You can do this in peacetime. You would assign these positions just to supplement income. Like Anthony pointed out, official salaries are very low, and they're very low for a reason, because you are not just expected to participate in these corrupt structures, you are required, you are obligated to participate in these corrupt structures. If you attend to not be dirty, everyone else is going to give you a choice, either be dirty or be dead.
Which gets to our next example here in order of, thematic connection. Vladimir Verteletsky, head of the Department of Public Procurement of the Russian Defense Ministry. He's the guy who buys stuff. I feel I don't need to explain where corruption can take place when you're the head of the office that does the buying. Then Vladimir Teleyev, he's a bit of a outlier here in that he was the deputy head of the Federal Penitentiary Service of Russia for the Moscow region. Of course, the most important region, but the jail guy. Which, of course, includes a lot of procurement, lots of personnel. It's a whole structure within itself that contains all these other functions. But the last one, I think, is the most interesting in that he was already out of a job. So Ivan Popov, he was the former commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army. And he got a bit of an interesting reputation in Russia as seemingly the only general that actually cared at all about the well-being of his soldiers. He put in a lot of complaints to Gerasimov, the chief of staff, and Shoigu, the defense minister, complaining about how his soldiers weren't given enough ammunition, not given enough medical supplies and medevac. Basically, he was upset that his soldiers were being told to go die. No, I'm not going to treat this guy as a hero. I want his soldiers to die, preferably as quickly as possible. But from his perspective, he was the only one in the entire Russian army who seemed not to agree with me on that point. And because of that, he was stripped of command. He very quickly became an enemy of the Russian military power structures. He had already become basically persona non grata. So his arrest here is more of insult on top of injury, or the other way around in this case, injury on top of insult. So what were these people arrested for? Well, we've been talking this whole time about corruption, and they were all arrested for corruption. But it's Russia. Corruption isn't really illegal. So what it is everyone is guilty of this crime. And because everyone is guilty, everyone is both simultaneously innocent and guilty at the same time. As long as you keep doing it with the blessing of your superiors and ultimately the blessing of Putin, that's just the regular part of how your job works. Like I said, it's expected. If you go against this system, you'll have more problems than anything. However, because this is all still technically a crime that everyone's doing, if you ever get in trouble for anything else, then they can quickly pin the crimes that they know about on you. Or sometimes, if someone is being corrupt, they can just make up an entirely different corruption case that you are actually innocent of while ignoring the corruption cases that you're guilty of.
It's because the corruption cases you're guilty of may implicate other people who are not currently being punished. And so you very often will have to prosecute people for made-up crimes just to avoid, dragging a whole web of corruption into the light.
And also, if you actually prosecute crimes people actually do as opposed to the crimes they don't do, then that means you have something resembling a criminal justice system. And Russia can't have that. You can't actually have enforceable law. The whole point is lawlessness. But why? Why did this happen now? And in the case of Ivan Popov, we know why the Russians are arresting him. He was already an enemy of the state because he had the gall to say that he wanted his soldiers to not die needlessly. But for the others, these were all normal parts of the military structure. These were all favored members. They had very high positions, but their main boss was just moved out of the defense ministry, Shoigu, and as we talked about last episode, into a different post in the National Security Council. So now there is a new defense minister, and my theory is that this defense minister basically wanted to mark his territory. He wanted to move out any loyalists of Shoigu so he can move his own people in to replace them. Pretty kind of normal corporate stuff. When the new bosses come in, they bring in their people and will often, in one way or another, push out the old people in order to do that. Everyone's familiar with that kind of thing.
Now, if you'll indulge me in a bit of criminology, since this is an apropos time to indulge, I guess, there's also an aspect of the kind of FSB MOD conflict going on. The FSB lost a lot of its reputation and a lot of face in Putin's eyes following the 2022 invasion, since obviously the intelligence that they provided turned out to be not just wrong, but so catastrophically wrong. Putin and Russia have been trapped in a war they did not want or expect for the past 2 years with no end in sight. So the FSB, it really is desperate, has been desperate to reestablish itself as a competent or at least loyal lackey. The FSB has also been tasked as one of the main forces that is investigating all of these. I say investigating, you should imagine air quotes, all of these newly opened corruption cases against these prior officials. And it's likely that they are the ones that are taking point on the purge. They're likely singling people out. And there's going to be some sort of pushback sooner or later from the MOD on this. Putin, as an authoritarian, and historically, this is a tactic used by all authoritarians, they don't want their lackeys, their minions, to be overly competent, because people who are overly competent often spot inaccuracies and inefficiencies promoted by a tier leader, which is bad. Then people might get ideas, they give suggestions, what might turn into demands, they start pushing. It's a whole thing. So you want to kind of keep your subjects at each other's throat. Hitler famously bungled the Second World War, mostly because not mostly, but in large parts because he promoted this very cutthroat competition between the various wings of his military. That is not an efficient way to run a system or prosecute a war, but it is a personally efficient way for the dictator in charge. So it's unlikely that the Ministry of Defense, which itself wants to prove itself, there's the new minister, he has to reorganize stuff, he's got to somehow reduce the level of procurement corruption, he has to somehow reduce the level of corruption in the military-industrial complex, he has to somehow promote integration between the military-industrial complex and the military leadership. He's got a bunch of officers that are kind of scared for their lives of being dragged out and put on a show trial by the FSB or ratted out by their own colleagues. It's a very fractious time, and it's likely that there are going to be forces in the Ministry of Defense, maybe not the minister, but maybe deputy ministers, that are going to feel threatened enough by the FSB to push back. We haven't seen that pushback yet, but I would be surprised if we did not, considering that personalities here, the personalities, especially of the minister, and this guy isn't career military or anything, is going to cause a big clash with the military leadership overall. And the army and the FSB have never gotten along historically anyway.
Yeah, so Andrei Belousov, the newly crowned Minister of Defense, like you just said, he's a complete outsider to the army. He does not have the connections within it, which means that, at least for now, he doesn't really have the ability to strike back, but it will only be a matter of time until he's able to create his own power structure. And once he has that power structure, become jealous of that power structure and seek to defend it from the FSB and anyone else who might be in competition with the army. And you also have to keep in mind that the actual army itself and the civilian leadership of the Ministry of Defense are also not always completely lockstep with each other either, but just the natural forces of how power works, from an almost zoological perspective here, is that eventually Belousov will have enough of a power base to want to defend, and so on the cycle will continue. Now for our next segment, an update on the Georgia protests, and this week I want to talk more about the international reaction to them. Just keep in mind the actual news updates on that is that the quote-unquote Russian law putting severe restrictions on Georgian civil society was first passed by Parliament. Then it was vetoed by the president. Then after it went back to Parliament, they overrode the veto. And after overriding the veto, again, escalations in police violence. But just focusing on the international reaction to it for now. And both the European Union and the United States have reacted very negatively to news of the Georgian government inching closer to Russia through this law. So for the European Union, well, the European Union has kind of been dropping hints that if Georgia passes the Russian law, then they would be acting against their membership plan to join the EU. So they would potentially lose their EU candidate status. Since they passed the law, course, that means that, well, they haven't lost candidate status yet, but more and more officials within the EU, within the executive branch of the EU, importantly, have been stating that, well, Georgia's not following the rules that we set, so sorry, you can't be part of this membership plan anymore. Which then leads to crazier behavior from the Georgia Dream Party. They have been very quickly, and when I say quickly, I mean lightning pace, been losing control of their perspective of reality. So Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze said that he had received a phone call from a member of the EU Commission who threatened him with basically assassination for his political activities. There was an allusion to the attempted assassination of Fico of Slovakia. We talked about that last episode. Basically alluding that the Prime Minister of Georgia would be assassinated over going against the wishes of the EU. So what happened next? Well, there was a huge investigation to see who this guy could possibly be, who could have given this threat. There's only so many people on the EU Commission on enlargement, and you can kind of track the whereabouts of where any of them would be. So the investigation narrowed it down to Oliver Velehely, Hungarian name. Again, sorry to Hungarian listeners if we have any, but can't pronounce that so well. So Oliver Velehely, and this turned out to be true. This came from the Hungarian member of the commission. But that led to a lot of head scratching because the Orban government is an ally of the Georgia Dream Party. The Hungarians want Georgia to join the EU with a kind of EU hostile government because that will allow them to cause more problems. They have kind of lost their reliable ally in the Polish government as a problem child, so gaining one in Georgia is very much to their benefit. So is it true that this Hungarian, who had absolutely no reason to say anything bad about Georgia Dream, threatened to murder him? And the answer is, of course, no. Oliver came out with a statement denying that that's what he said. He took him completely out of context and just straight up lied about this communication between the European Union and the Georgia government. But why lie about this? Like, I understand that they want to make it look like the big bad Europeans are coming for us and they're trying to eliminate our sovereignty and all that, but it would eventually come out that wasn't true, and in this case came out as not being true in the most humiliating and pathetic ways for the reasons I just explained. This is his ally. He decided to completely humiliate his closest ally in the European Union. Now, was this done as a way to make EU membership even more of an impossibility by driving away his champion? I don't think so. I just think they're being crazy and are taking every opportunity to be crazy that they possibly can. The Georgia Dream Party has been going deeper and deeper into conspiracism. One member of their party, one parliamentarian, went on a rant about how this is all a plot by the Freemasons. Kind of went old school there. You haven't heard a good old Freemason conspiracy theory take front and center in quite a while. And of course, blaming the quote unquote global war party, these shadowy figures acting behind the scenes to destroy Georgia.
They would save so much time if they would just admit they want to say Jews.
It feels like they keep wanting to say Jews without directly saying Jews. We talked about before about how they are more or less labeling protesters as rootless cosmopolitans, Freemason conspiracy theories, historical facts about what we kind of covered when we talked about the history of Russian anti-Semitism. A lot of the kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories through the protocols of the Elders of Zion, they started as Freemason conspiracy theories. So they're worded the same way. Like, these people are not creative. It's just say Jews. Just say Jews, guys. Global war party, the globalists. But anyway, so the U.S. reaction. The U.S. reaction is not as critical because Georgia is trying to join the EU. The EU's opinion of them is quite important. And if they lose their candidate status, that is a pretty crushing blow to them domestically. That, like, Georgians want that. But the U.S. is still a factor here as well. So the U.S. decided to put travel restrictions on politicians responsible for this Russian law. They said, if you are responsible for this undermining of Georgian democracy, you may not travel to the U.S. And there was another statement that the United States government would, quote, have a comprehensive review of bilateral cooperation between the U.S. and Georgia. There was a little bit of a carrot and a stick to this, in that Georgia would be given some preferable trade policies if they do drop this Russian law, because that would prove that they're like a good democracy we can work with, so we can increase more favorable trade. And if they put the law in place, as in do the opposite and prove that they're not a good democracy, then there will be a reconsideration of some of the bilateral cooperation between the two countries. But here comes my own conspiracism, because some of the Georgia Dream politicians who would be subject to this policy of not being able to go to the U.S. gave some pretty troubling statements that a lot of oppositionists interpreted in a very scary way. So one Georgia Dream MP said that he would rather go to Abkhazia and Skinavali, or South Ossetia. And this is in line with a lot of comments made by Georgia Dream insiders that this law would help with sovereignty, that it would be the main way to keep the Russians from invading Georgia, that soon we would restore our territorial wholeness, and these Westerners are trying to prevent that, which led to a lot of theorizing among the opposition. And I very much see where they're coming from this, that they're starting to believe that there's some kind of grand bargain between Georgia Dream and Russia that basically says that if you are more amenable to Russian influence, if you align your government war more with Russian goals and ideals, if you basically sabotage your own relationship with the EU, then Russia in exchange would basically hand back Abkhazia and South Ossetia in one form or another. And as much as the Georgians would like these territories to be reunited with Georgia, Russia just offering them is obviously a poison pill. In such an arrangement, the Russians would not give up their occupation governments in these two regions, and basically they would be asked to rejoin Georgia as autonomous regions that are able to heavily influence Georgian politics. That basically how it would end up is that a large percentage of the Georgian parliament would be more or less directly appointed by Russia through its proxies in these two regions, and then whatever other agreements about having more hostile relations with the West, or having these two regions have some kind of veto authority over Georgian politics. When I say this, it sounds like a lot, but that's basically what they tried to do with Ukraine. Throughout the 10 years between the creation of the Donetsk and Luhansk occupation regimes and the full-scale invasion, what Russia was trying to do was have Ukraine reintegrate these two regions as autonomous entities with veto power over Ukrainian policy and the ability to say that you cannot have these relations with the West, you cannot build up your military to defend yourself, and anything that you want to do has to have the rubber stamp by officially these two autonomous regions, but really by Russia, making Ukraine just a vassal state of Russia, very directly a vassal state of Russia. And that is the concern that Georgians would have, because this has played out again and again and again. We also, just because this happened in the UN, the timing of it was quite interesting. Completely. The timing of it was relevant to my point here, was that in the United Nations, there was recently a vote to kind of commemorate the Srebrenica genocide in Bosnia by Serb forces. And how the Bosnian War ended was by the creation of Republika Srpska, an entity controlled by Serbia, by virtue of that, somewhat controlled by Russia, that has the veto authority over Bosnian politics. And as a result of that, the politics of Bosnia and Herzegovina have really never been able to get where they need to get. They want to do European integration, but because of this constitution that was forced on them by kind of the peacemakers in that conflict, the West, who wanted to just end things rather than a defeat of the Serbs, the constitution put in place by the Western powers itself disqualifies them from joining the EU in a lot of cases because does not meet the standards of civil rights, of respect for democracy and that kind of thing, because it's entirely based on making sure that this terrorist entity, Republika Srpska, has power. So over these years, a lot of Ukrainians very deliberately noticed that and did not want the Republika Srpska option for them. And now Georgians have to worry about it for them. And again, this is not official. This is just like almost a conspiracy theory itself. But the Georgia Dream Party keeps making statements that makes it sound like that's the case. If this was a more controlled news outlet that was more demanding of the things that I say, then I probably would not even be saying that. I would not be writing that in NV, for example. But because this is our podcast and we can say what we feel like, that's what I feel like saying.
Not out of the question. We've noted before that Putin would have liked to avoid a war, and almost no one in Russia besides Putin and in a place of authority would have ever chosen to go to war with Ukraine. And by extension, at least theoretically, Western industrial capacity. And on top of that, the very common feeling in Georgia that the Russian invasion in 2008 was sparked by Saakashvili, provoking Russia. And there's a lot of, and you get a recipe for at least a chunk of the Georgian electorate, which may be happy to come to that kind of agreement.
Yeah, it's definitely something to worry about anyway. Russia would prefer to take over through political wrangling and undermining countries from within, but if worse comes to worse, they would choose invasion. And again, what the Georgia Dream people sound like they're saying is that if they don't take this deal, then Russia will invade, so they're protecting Georgia in that way as well. So, but also, like I said, they keep sounding crazier and crazier, spinning up wild, kind of anti-Semitic, but not anti-Semitic sounding slurs against their opposition. So yeah, keeping all that in mind and keeping our eyes on Georgia. But to round off this episode with, again, a good old cultural topic to wind us down, we have the newly crowned undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Oleksandr Usyk. He is the first undisputed heavyweight champion since 1999 with Lennox Lewis. Boxing is a famously fragmented sport with various organizations and associations being able to name their own champions, and therefore, most of the time, each organization will have its own champions for each weight category. But if you're good enough, you will challenge the champions of the other associations and unite various titles. And in this case, the heavyweight champion, which again had not been united since 1999, one man, Oleksandr Usyk, holds all of the belts. Well, there's some weird technicalities there, so undisputed is a weird word, but it's undisputed anyway. So I don't know how many boxing fans are out there, but it was a very good fight. Tyson Fury, Oleksandr Usyk's opponent, who was the holder of other belts, is a very large man. He is considerably taller than Oleksandr and has considerably longer arms. In boxing, this is a major advantage. If you can hold someone off by just having longer arms, that means that they have to come a lot closer to you in order to hit you back. And while they are crossing that distance, you can hit them while they cannot hit you. So Fury had a very large physical advantage over Usyk. Usyk has been able to get over size disadvantages before, and there was a lot of back and forth. Through most of the fight, I'd say that Fury kind of had an advantage. He stumbled Usyk quite a few times. There were some times where Usyk was kind of waggling in his boots a little bit, but then came the 9th round. And in the 9th round, Usyk hit Fury with a massive punch that caused Fury to stumble back on the ropes. He was basically unconscious, falling from rope to rope. This was counted as a knockdown, not a knockout, but a knockdown. And this is one problem I have with boxing anyway, and why I slightly prefer MMA. And this resulted in a mixed martial arts fight. The fighter would then be able to pursue the person who is stumbling and end the fight right there. But because a fighter is able to kind of come back from this, they put themselves in a lot more risk for head injury. It's not good to get a concussion like what clearly happened to Fury and go back fighting. That's not good for your brain, but that's how boxing works. It's not always good for your brain, unfortunately, if you see older fighters. But
I mean, punching each other in the head repeatedly as a career is not great for future mental capacity and capability. No,
and like I said, there are ways to have rules to make it easier, but then it wouldn't be boxing. If fight was kind of paused to see if he could stand back up, and he was able to stand back up. If the round was able to continue, then Usyk would likely have been able to punch him again and cause a knockdown, but that was the end of the round. Saved by the bell. But into the 10th round, even though Fury was very heavily damaged, clearly, especially after the fight, it was noticeable. But into the 10th round, he was able to win the 10th round anyway, because Fury is a fantastic fighter in his own right. So again, lots of back and forth. That 9th round was definitely the most exciting. But in the end, it came down as a split decision win. Means the judges were not in agreement on this, but Oleksandr Usyk won the fight, again making him undisputed heavyweight champion. There will, of course, be a rematch. This was in the contract that there would be a rematch, and with such a close fight, everyone would want a rematch anyway, which will be in December. That closes out our episode with a real hero of the country, Oleksandr Usyk. We've talked about him in the past, about his history of being a guy literally from Crimea who had been much more amenable to Russian cultural influences, just to put it lightly, before the full-scale invasion, but after the invasion became much more of a patriot. He joined the territorial defense units until Klitschko suggested that he'd be more used to the country as a celebrity and an athlete. He has raised a ton of money for Ukrainian military and charitable causes, and he did a walkout actually in full Cossack regalia. He's wearing the robe and the hat and everything, so that was pretty cool. But that is all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to support Ukraine more broadly, go to the link in the description. The link tree contains resources and charities that you can donate to. If you would like to help this podcast, the best thing you can do is subscribe to us on whatever podcast network whatever podcast service you're listening to us on. Go to our YouTube channel, go to our TikTok, go to our Facebook, like all of them, like everything we do. Share it to your friends, get the algorithm working in our favor. Once the algorithm grabs something, it becomes a very major boost to any cultural product. If you'd like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/UkraineWithoutHype and join our list of supporters. We had a bit more in our Patreon this month, and they're trying to kind of increase production over there a bit, as well as joining our Discord channel. But now to thank our wonderful patrons. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kokratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike Perrone, Anna Karen Person, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Etienne Soleil, James Berg, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Marguerite, Michael Wickman, PLM, Shieldwall, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Adam Poppenheimer, Ada McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Emily Bivona, Brent Waugh, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Laura De Leon, Lori Halila, Libby Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noam Hart, Paul Bailey, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Berry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Subtle Knife, Thomas Sobiek, Veronica, Victoria Leontaneva, and Wandering Lens. Thank you all very much for your support. You would make this all possible. So until next week, Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава.